Hello, and welcome to Submerged, the podcast that brings you stories from the front line in environmental research, policy, and community action from the east coast of Canada and beyond by speaking directly to those working on the ground and in the lab. I'm your host, Graham Stewart Robertson, Executive Director of ACAP St. John, a nonprofit environmental organization that fosters great science, action, and planning in our marine and freshwater habitats here in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. Today, our guest is from one of our colleague organizations down the coast of the Bay of Fundy, Donald Killorn of Eastern Charlotte Waterways, or ECW. Mr. Killorn has been Executive Director of Eastern Charlotte Waterways since April 2012. Prior to that, he has designed and implemented ocean science projects in the Belize Barrier Reef and the Turks and Caicos Islands. Recently, Donald has been working with his group and others to monitor underwater noise in the Bay of Fundy, including St. John Harbor. And today we're going to hear from him directly about the opportunities and challenges associated with this incredible project. Donald, thanks so much for joining us today on Submerged.
Thank you for having me, Graham. It's great to be here.
So tell us just the Coles notes, the brief picture. Why do we care about underwater noise in the Bay of Fundy? What started this whole project?
Well, noise is a pollutant. It's like air pollution or pollution in the fresh water. It's a form of energy that we put out when we engage in activity, and it's disruptive. I got interested in it because in its most severe forms, it can be fatal to, those animals that we think of as, that real charismatic the porpoise and the whales, and underwater noise can be very disruptive to them. They are communicating to each other in much the same way that we are. I mean, obviously our capabilities are a little more what's the word, intricate than theirs. But
there's a bad podcast joke in there somewhere.
Yeah, there's a podcast joke in there somewhere. I mean, who invented the podcast, really? But so it struck me as something that I'd be interested in. And when I arrived at Eastern Charlotte Waterways, it was a time of potential increased activity in the St. John Harbor. There was talk of the Energy East pipeline, the potash. There was additions around potash, around tugboats. And there wasn't a clear sense in the community about the current level of underwater noise or what the impact would be. So without knowing that, I didn't feel like you could responsibly do these types of developments. And at the heart of our organizations, that's what we're there to do, is go out and answer those questions. And so began the project. We were lucky to have a very qualified academic partner here in St. John at the University of New Brunswick, Dr. Jack Terhune, who's been working with this type of data for a very long time, and he gave us expertise and guidance and support, and we received some funding from various levels of government and have been trying to build our capacity since 2014, 2015.
Yeah. And what's the project? How would you evaluate how it's gone so far? I mean, this is something relatively new, as you pointed out, in the Bay of Fundy. Yeah,
I mean, our survival at ECW is always sort of the clearest sign of success, but the project has been, you and I, we're in these roles where we have to keep these ideas alive, sometimes just with our own passion and ambition. And so we had a initial investment, and then, we kept at it, kept throwing this gear in the water, sort of on our own dime, and now we've arrived at a place where we've established more support. So from my position, it's been successful because it's still happening. I know that we're going to be doing this work for the next 2 or 3 years, and that's as clear a sign of success as any. But from an information standpoint, I think that I almost take for granted now how much we know about underwater noise in the Bay of Fundy, and to think that we went from nothing to what we have now. With that said, it's more difficult than I anticipated to really help those animals that I mentioned. For now, we have a good handle on how much noise is out there, but without knowing exactly where they're at or what they're trying to do, we don't really know what sort of impact they're feeling, except that if they're still here, we can assume that it's not that bad.
Yeah.
And so I think that we've come a long way with it.
Yeah. So give any listeners out there who might not be familiar an idea of what types of noise you might be getting through these hydrophones, these underwater microphones. Is it something that, if you played it back for us, would we recognize anything? Does it just sound like low droning? Like, describe it a little bit.
Well, you catch a couple different types. Weather makes a lot of noise. The loudest months in the Bay of Fundy tend to be, January and February, because the sea state is just so overall. And then we start to see different types of noise at different parts of the spectrum. The ships are creating a lot of noise when they're arriving and departing in very specific frequencies, but those aren't necessarily the frequencies that we're seeing the porpoise clicks or the humpback whale calls. We don't pick up a lot of conversations. Like if you're having a chat with your friend on Water Street, like I'm not going to be able to kind of get the gossip, but that's really it. It's weather and it's industrial shipping and it's smaller boats and animals and that's really what makes up the noise.
And there must be tools that help you separate or identify what's weather, what's a ship, or at least help you work through that?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, software is so key. It's interesting how key software has become to what we do, increasingly so all the time. And working with, Dr. Terhune, who's been doing this since certainly, before the digital age was upon us, tells me stories, about working with tapes and trying to do analysis. But we have software tools that are being developed all over the world. And we make investments in software, and those are key pieces of capacity for our organizations. As you know, it's like buying a boat or buying a truck, spending $15,000 on a piece of software that does this one thing, but that's what it does, right? And so we can't do it without those tools, and they pull the noise apart for us, so we make a recording like we're making right now, and then these software tools will pull it into its disparate frequencies, and we begin analysis from there and start to make comments about how polluted is the environment at 63 hertz versus 125 hertz. How much porpoise activity is up in the higher registers, and how many humpback songs are down at 20 hertz, and start to spread it around, because it may be loud at a certain frequency. It's very, there's a dynamic to sound that I didn't appreciate before I started working on it, that if there's noise at 500 hertz and a humpback wants to communicate with another humpback at 20 hertz, it's not necessarily going to disrupt that.
Right. There's
room in the spectrum for both of them, even though we sort of just think of sound as presence or absence. But our work goes a little bit deeper into the physics of it than that.
Great.
Yeah, it's been a real good learning experience, which is another, I think you'll agree, is another sign of success of a project. When we're learning a lot about
building capacity
about our
in your
work.
people too. I'm sure that way.
Yeah, it's been it's a challenging thing. And I carry I carry a lot of institutional memory, as you do, and sort of pass it on to team members as they come. And the project has had team members sort of work on it and then, depart, and new team members come in. And it's been an opportunity for various environmental professionals to add this sort of acoustic piece to their career. And it's increasingly, a unique piece of work that you can't do everywhere.
Yeah. And I understand that you've got not just the support, but the ear, pardon the pun, of several levels of government or departments for this research, because it is so important for establishing zones or shipping routes and things like that. Is that right?
Yeah, you learn a lot, and it's a way to say something about the environment pretty quickly. Like, you and I both know that it's difficult to really say. It takes a long time to say definitive things about the environment and how we're managing it, and it can take a long time to. And if you can't make those statements, it's difficult to make improvements. Yeah. But noise is a topic where we could sort of arrive and take some measurements and say this is the current state of affairs, and so what we found is that a place like Passamaquoddy Bay is so quiet because of Deer Island and Campobello Island that, you start to understand why there's sort of exceptional whale activity there. And for all its activity, the Port of St. John is actually incredibly well managed when it comes to noise. It's not a place like, Port Vancouver works really hard to manage its noise because it's a very sensitive area with the orcas, but also they have a problem, right? They have to find a way to bring the noise down. But we haven't seen that yet, which is great, So we do get to communicate that to the regulators and the users, and it's nice to have a kind of a good news story, but then begin to work with them and establish the credibility so that we can be a participant in managing the environment and managing sort of the available amplitude. And it reminds me a lot of our work with climate change as well, where globally we're starting to really nail down the available sort of our available carbon budget.
Right.
You set the goal, whether it's 1.5 degrees warming or whether it's 100 decibels of noise, and then you figure out what you have to work with, and then those are the facts, right? And you got to chop it up and make sure that it gets used in a way that can support our economies and make sure that we support as many families as possible with our natural resources, because that's what it comes down to here. Whether you're monitoring noise or whether you're fish and lobster or whether you're trying to whether you're trying to improve the health of Marsh Creek, what we're all doing is trying to keep the natural world healthy and take what we need from it to support ourselves and our communities, and really we all want to leave enough behind for the next generation, and it's just some cultures are better at that than others, and we're all sort of struggling to find our way.
Yeah, I think that comparison with the idea of carbon budgeting and just comparison to climate change is great, because you mentioned, you still want to keep economies and growth and people, having their livelihoods. And I think, the more we understand something like carbon, just like this noise, what can come out of it are not just policies, but innovations around reducing it. Maybe there's improvements down the line in ships which generate less noise, or new hull designs, and all this great things, which I'm sure is well underway to being studied now.
Yeah, and that's really where we want to get to, where we can place Port St. John, who's a fantastic partner and is maintains an open door policy with us, and will hear out our even our most harebrained schemes, but we want to put Port St. John in a position where when ships arrive, they get that information and say, you're performing well, you're not performing well. And your point around innovation is well taken, because really what we're talking about is energy. Yeah. And what we want to do is be using less energy. And our generation has less energy. We have to do more with less. And that begins, transportation is a great place for that to begin. So when we think about noise, a ship that's putting out more noise than it should, or more than the industry average, it probably means it's also burning more fossil fuels as it makes its way around the world. So those questions, we're trying to electrify our transportation. It'll mean it's quieter. That's one of the things we see with electric cars. Noise tends to be equated, whether we know it or not, with carbon pollution.
So, thinking of the hydrophones and your work itself, maybe, again, for the benefit of anyone listening, can you describe the act of getting these microphones out? What do they look like, and how on earth do you get them to survive in this one of the toughest marine environments you can deal with?
Yeah. That was a big learning curve for us. And you, I'm sure, can empathize with me, where you have this idea and you write it down on paper, and someone tells you that they're going to let you do it. And all of a sudden, it's the most terrifying thing. You have to go put these things in the ocean.
It's like a joyful terror.
It's a joyful terror. Yeah, that should be the name of this podcast.
Oh, I like it.
A joyful terror. But so this is the part where I tell you what a great team I have, and really from the bottom of my heart, I mean it. The people work so hard to develop these solutions, and initially we had this homemade crab pot design that we lashed the hydrophone to, and hung our battery pack in the middle of it. Was our first big innovation. And then so we tossed it over the side and connected it to the surface with a marker buoy. And we did that. We went out to look for them, and we couldn't find any of them. And so that was not a great start.
Not particularly. I don't imagine these are, cheap off the shelf.
No, it's like it's
Yeah.
like taking a Toyota Tercel to the Bay of Fundy and tossing it in the water and not being able to find it later. And so you don't want to have to go buy 5 more Toyota Tercels.
No.
So we realized that the currents were so strong, not the tides. Like, we learned the difference between tides and currents. That was a big lesson. And the currents were so strong that they were pulling our buoys underwater. So we started to collect them at slack tide. That was a big learning experience. And we got all 5 of them back, and we've never lost one. And now we've received some funding from DFO very recently from their St. John baseline monitoring study to actually increase our capacity to include acoustic releases. So we've kind of evolved and now have a caliber of equipment that you would see with Dalhousie, with the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, JASCO Applied Sciences, the groups that are doing the work all across Atlantic Canada and the Arctic and in the Pacific Ocean. They let us go to it in the Bay of Fundy. They kind of give me a little pat in the head and say, go to it, man. If that's what you want to do, if you're going to do it in the Bay of Fundy, I get great support from them. Dr. Chris Taggart at Dalhousie has been an incredible supporter. His whole team, Hillary Morris-Murphy at DFO, the folks at JASCO, like, no one's ever sort of tried to stand in our way, because we are the ones that there's a skill set to operating on this marine environment that you don't get necessarily. There's different challenges with where they operate off Nova Scotia and off Newfoundland. But so we have a caliber of gear now that we're quite pleased with. We're not sort of you can now fix these things to autonomous gliders. We're not quite at that level yet, but that would be there's a few places we might go with it. An autonomous glider is tougher to justify than sort of a real-time monitoring network, which is what we're more interested in. Fixed monitoring is sort of fits with the shipping lane better than an autonomous glider.
Walk us through what real-time monitoring would do for.
Well, a real-time monitoring, we see real-time monitoring in the Boston Harbor is really the first time we saw it in North America, and it's recently been added to Port Vancouver. And what it is really just a network of hydrophones, interconnected, and they're relaying information in real time to the ships via existing communication systems on the ship. And the really impressive part, and what we're seeing more and more of in noise and all through environmental management, is the ability to analyze these incredibly large files in real time, identify the whale, really triangulate its location, and ship that information. Send that information to the ship, which allows the ship to traverse the shipping lane very safely. Now, we've had a lot of success. The change in the shipping lane here predates me and really stands as an incredible partnership between environmental managers and industry. But a real-time network will sort of take it to another level of safety for the North Atlantic right whale, for the other whales, the finbacks and the humpbacks that are also out there.
Have you had any surprise finds in that? Mentioning,
well, there's
a couple whales. There's some surprises.
I mean, the first biggest surprise was that, how great, the results were the first big surprise. The fact that Port St. John was doing such a good job managing the impact. But in terms of animals, we send the data through these algorithms. So the robots go through the data for us, and they pick out things that might be animals. And we then go into the data and sort of ground truth it by listening to the samples and say, is it there, is it not there? And so we had a hit for an orca whale, and everyone kind of assured me that was going to be a mistake. But I had never heard of there being an orca in the Bay of Fundy before. So I went on Google and searched that, and there was actually a news story on the CBC from the same week as our sample had been collected. A group of whale watchers off Grand Manan had seen this whale, and the whale was a known commodity around Grand Manan, that this orca, Old Tom, had been living there. And so sure enough, like, I learned a little bit that day about what's out there. I don't think we have a huge orca population, but I thought of it, there was a lot of, you and I kind of move in the same circles, and there was it was really interesting last year. We started to see more photos of orcas from off Nova Scotia, and we started to get a feel for the kind of Atlantic population of orcas. And it's interesting, and it's, that's one of the incredible things about social media and Instagram in particular, is that you can use it to drive awareness and interest in environmental management through some of those animals, and that's important here in the Bay of Fundy too.
Yeah, and it's a great touchstone for something unseen and probably seemingly very distant, like underwater noise that we'll probably never expose ourselves to directly. But if you see, as you say, an Instagram image or something on social media or in a news story that has that image of the affected animals, especially something as resonant with a population like a whale or an orca, I mean, that goes a long way to actually driving home a message, I would imagine, about it.
Yeah, we're really lucky. Like, we're really lucky here that there are places where they are searching for oil and gas using sound, and there are places where they are conducting Navy exercises using sound, and in those places, there are mass beachings, and there are animals that are in so much pain that they have to escape from. It would be like if your house was on fire, so you jumped into the bay, and so those images are horrific, and what sort of drove my interest on the topic, but thankfully is not part of my sort of the practice of the study.
Well, I'm very relieved to hear that. Yeah,
especially as a resident. I'm sure all your listeners are as well. Yeah, every now and again, like Machias Seal Island is just this horrific. That's absolutely not happening. I can't be clear enough that that's not happening.
No, and it is. I think for anyone who might be resident of the Maritimes or this part of Canada, a bit of a relief to hear.
Yeah,
that there is. Comparatively a fairly low level of
well, and as Canadians, we need to be very conscious about what's happening in the Arctic. And I don't, I'm not going to sit here and preach about it, but we have this environment that's these animals love, and it's super quiet up there. That's not a technical term, but we don't want to just. Again, it goes back to that idea of taking what we need to support ourselves, but also. Doing so with as little impact. And there will be electric ships passing through the Northwest Passage, and they'll do so very quietly, and that's wonderful. There's been a lot of talk recently about how Canada is the fastest warming country in the world, and that's really resonated with our urban populations. But, of course, that stat means more about what's happening up north than it does what's happening to us here on the border.
Yeah, and that's true of a great many topics in Canada where a lot of the resource use and impact is somewhat created in one domain, in the urban domain, and often felt first as an impact in, the boreal forest or the north and the North Sea and all these different places. So the Arctic Ocean, excuse me.
Yeah, Canada's the boreal forest is a remarkable thing.
That's a topic for a whole other.
You need a boreal forest. You need a boreal forest expert. I won't say much more, but some of the stats around the Canadian Shield and the boreal forest, it's a remarkable ecosystem.
It truly is.
Yeah.
Before we go, thank you again for joining us to tell us these immense stories. But I always like to end with a little bit of asking what your pie in the sky vision is. I mean, you mentioned real-time monitoring. All these other things, but if I gave you as many Toyota Tercels,
all the Tercels
money that
hashtag all the Tercels
that you could do, that's a very timely. The Tercel hasn't been on the market in 20 years, but it's still a good comparison.
Yeah, I suspect the hydrophones are actually more expensive.
Currently, resale value probably.
Yeah.
What is your sort of dream for whether it's ECW's work or could be any underwater noise monitoring? Just put on your dreamer hat there for a moment.
Yeah, I got an email when I was on my way, when I was getting ready to leave the office, and started talking about the port of Hamburg in Germany and how they were
One of the largest ports in the world, yeah.
and they were looking at our work and were very interested in what we were doing and how they could work on it. Now, I kept waiting for the invitation part of the email to come to Hamburg and present it to them, but it never came. But that's, taking what we have, to the Arctic, back to the Turks and Caicos where the humpbacks are passing through, sort of getting to that comfort level where we can become sort of traveling practitioners interests me a little bit, but at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is stitch together the right measurements to manage Southwest New Brunswick with those goals that we talked about in mind. We have some really crucial industries here. Forestry is a crucial industry. Aquaculture is increasingly crucial to the world, to the whole world, and certainly to our economy. And between those two industries, the rivers flow, and down through Reversing Falls or into the Magadavy Basin or past St. Andrews. And how does that all interact? And people may think that we know that, or that we can sort of say anything definitive about that, but we don't. So when it comes to underwater noise, or it comes to water quality, or biodiversity, or all the things that you and I work on, the pie in the sky is that in 10 years and 15 years, with all this technology, we're going to be able to definitively say that if we give back this much buffer, we can grow this much more salmon. Or if we, if we give back this much buffer, we can and take back this many salmon farms, we're going to get this much more lobster. And so that we can start to really manage our natural resources in an effective way, and use these technologies not just to take, but to really create a system that will feed us, forever.
Wow. That's quite the beautiful vision of a symbiotic technology, humanity.
Well, you said pie, so I figured I'd keep it with food.
That perfect sense. I was thinking the number pie, but I kid. Thanks so much, Donald, for joining us.
My pleasure, Graham. My pleasure.
We hope that you've enjoyed this episode of Submerged, featuring the incredible work of Donald Killorn and Eastern Charlotte Waterways, taking place right here in the Bay of Fundy in New Brunswick, Canada. Stay tuned for upcoming episodes of Submerged, which will feature topics from the benefits of gardening to renewable energy. Be sure to subscribe to our feed and follow our podcast by visiting acapsj.org, as Submerged continues to bring you stories from the front line of environmental research, policy, and community action from the East Coast and beyond. Until next time, I'm your host, Graham Stewart Robertson. Submerged has been produced and distributed to you by ACAP St. John, an environmental nonprofit which has been working in St. John, New Brunswick, Canada since 1992.